welcome to Collected Stories. This is Kyra,
This is Dawn,
and we're going to be
and
reviewing our book of the month, Thistlefoot. So the two characters are puppeteers, by trade. That's how they grew up, right? And they were trained from such a young age to engage with an audience. And the stories that, come to life around them of their folklore coming back from their family past, all of these stories, right, require an audience, a listener, a witness, they call it, like to
yes,
bear witness. There's so much importance, not just telling the story, but listening to the story and having the heart to sit there and hear hard things. And the book at times directly addresses you. It uses the word you in the chapter. Like
yes,
in the chapters where the book is speaking of, oh,
yeah,
you thought I was going to tell you that story. We're not going to talk about that yet. We're going to talk about the fairy tale version yet. We're not
yeah,
going to get to that part yet. And it's asking you to listen to the story.
that
And I
totally
thought that
breaks the
was
fourth wall.
yes, yeah. I thought it was so beautifully done that for a book to make, the characters are characters, the objects are characters, the story is a character, and the audience is a character, and as important as the characters and as the plot that's happening, to
Yes,
balance all of that and to do it well, I thought was a feat on its own. I was really impressed about that.
yeah, yes, I loved the breaking of the fourth wall, and I think you're right. Like, I didn't think of it that way, but yeah, I totally agree. You do feel like definitely part of the story. Um,
Yeah, you felt like important by reading the book because it's asking you to pass along the story and to carry it in your heart. With Long Shadow Man, when they're trying to figure out how to solve the conflict, they, he feeds on erasure of the people, erasure of the language, of the culture, of the stories, right? He's trying to take all of it away from them. And by fighting back, they're just telling the stories again, right? He's shifting into the different people that are no longer, and he's like, you will not forget me, you will not forget this, right? And so as the reader, you feel so important of like, I won't forget it either. Like, I'm going to carry these people's stories with me too, even if it's not real, even if that exact person didn't exist, right? But like the events and the culture that have like really originated after this fairy tale, I will carry with me.
you'll at least remember the essence of the story, and they even talk about how like the house and Isaac, things change, the story
Mm-hmm.
changes to
Yes.
whatever, but it's still in essence the same story. It's just the details change a little bit. It's
Yeah. It's much more accurate to operate from that mindset in today's world because things are just inherently messy. I mean, I
yeah,
don't even know if they've ever been not messy, to be honest.
yeah,
But, as we talk about at my line of work with addiction, like just because you're addicted to drugs doesn't mean you're better or worse than a person who's addicted to their phone.
yeah,
Think obviously the consequences are very different. But the morality that gets attached to it, right? Like people, well, I think what Isaac was dealing with was people look down on his morals and him as a person for
yeah,
stealing, but not, for other things that are have greater consequences, or for people of power who do it, right? There aren't the same judgments. What it reminded me of when the Long Shadow Man first used the like the drink, like, and
oh yeah,
gave it to someone, I thought, why doesn't that person attack the Long Shadow Man, right? And it feeds on the insecurities and the fear of the other and the other person, so that
yeah,
they're fighting the first person that they see as other, right? And they're fighting like with the cab driver, right? It reminds me of this comedic bit by George Carlin that's, it's meant to be funny, but I think people laugh because there's often a bit of truth to it. And so, but he talks about how people become so fixated on finding differences in others, like whether it's race, religion, sex, gender, whatever it is, like ability difference. We get so caught up in fighting about what that means for our identity and what that means for our culture and what that means for our group, that we're fighting amongst ourselves and nobody's looking at the top. And the powerful will stay powerful and they will stay in charge because
yeah,
they've created all these different factions for the people below them to bicker and fight about and debate their their realness and their identity and all of these things right
Yeah.
below them, so that no one ever looks above, right? And so that's what I feel like the book was almost confronting, of like all of these people who get intoxicated into this drug and look to each other to fight, and they get so drunk they don't even recognize themselves anymore, and they're just trying to perceive this otherness and drive it into the ground, that no one ever actually looks at the Long Shadow Man. And that's what the ending kind of coalesced into, of like
Yeah.
taking the destruction and the powerful and the 1% head on, right? Like they never say he's a monster, the Long Shadow Man, or not
Yeah.
they, the band people do, because they're just like, screw
Yeah.
this guy.
Yeah.
But Isaac and Bellatine, they never say he's a monster. They say he's just a man with power.
Yeah. The horror wasn't necessarily a person. It was an event, which
Mhm.
then became Long Shadow. But and that it was a true event, not necessarily that it happened in the town that they said, but that town was based on a real town. And it was heartbreaking.
Yeah.
And it wasn't the only town that happened to. And
Yeah.
it's not the only time it's happened in the history of mankind. I mean, my heart was breaking. I was, the reality of it. And I don't know, it just, really the progression of the book from the fairy tale to real life, just, all through the house books.
Mhm.
Um, but it like solves the mystery of it
Yeah.
as well.
And what I really loved about this book, and how I think even in our first video where we introduced ourselves and talked about what books we loved, and talked about loving fantasy, and how sometimes they get embarrassed to tell people that because they write it off as a story that's not real and therefore could not contribute any lesson or perspective into their real lives.
Yeah.
This book challenges what is real head on. It
Yeah.
talks all the time, right? She brings inanimate objects to life and has to question, is this real? Is this person real? Is that real? And is the story real? And is the house real? Even if it doesn't live
Yeah.
and breathe like I do, it is real.
Yeah.
And they take lessons away from it and experiences away from it that change their lives. And it no longer becomes, is this real, but what kind of impact is this going to have on me? Like it shifts more to the experience.
Yeah.
um, and I thought that was a beautiful reminder of how, even if it's a fairy tale and you don't believe that person to have lived and died on this earth, as people live and die on this earth,
Yep.
their story can still be real, and the fact that it has consequences and an impact on your life and how you see the world.
Yeah. And the fact that, like, Thistlefoot, yeah, houses don't walk around on this planet. But I think it's more of a metaphor.
Mhm.
Number one, it's a fairy tale. So of course that's gonna happen. Houses are magical in fairy tales. I mean, the Wicked Witch has, or Hansel and Gretel has the house of candy. But I
Mhm.
also like the fact that she used the fairy tale. None of this was Disneyified, however you would say that. The old fairy tales, they talk about Rapunzel and, he was blinded, the prince was blinded, and um you think if you do research on the Little Mermaid, you realize it's nothing like the Little Mermaid that Disney did. And I like that she kept that. Like, this fairy tale of Baba Yaga ended in sadness and heartbreak, and that's more like fairy tales used to be. Real
Like
life.
more like real life, yeah.
Yeah.
Of it's not whether they won or that they lost or that they lived or that they died. It's just that this thing happened and it's worth remembering because it was so great and so terrible and so
Yeah.
important for people to know, that you just have to remember it and you have to tell it, and you don't have to spin it into anything for it to be just important, uh, in its value.
So I'm exhausted from this book. It took me a while to read this. I know you read it full on.
Full disclaimer to our viewers, I read this book and I finished it 10 minutes before sitting down and doing this video. So my thoughts are fresh, even though my memory of whatever person's name is not, that will not change with time.
Yeah. And I finished it this afternoon.
Mhm.
But it just I think that's because of the way it was written. I had to read all of it. There was no skimming involved for me.
Yeah, and you couldn't, because even if you wanted to, there were so many passages that I wanted to highlight and write down,
Yeah.
that I thought were beautiful, and I actually wanted to read one. Well, first of all, I wanted to highlight the entire prologue. I thought this prologue of the book should be an example of what a prologue should do for a book. It opened up with what is the plant Thistlefoot, and laid so many metaphors and so many interpretations and openings for meanings throughout the rest of the book just by reading the prologue. So I thought that was beautiful. But one quote that really stuck out to me from the book, and it's short, so that's why I wanted to read it, but what happens when the walls we raise outlive the dangers they were built to keep out? At one point, does a fort become a cage? I
Yeah.
thought that was so beautiful. I thought this book also not just commented a lot on stories and the power of stories, but also trauma and collective trauma and the way it stores in our bodies and our memories and our genetics. I took actually a whole class on that, but we won't get into it. And I thought that was such a beautiful quote for, at what point do we move past these coping skills, these coping mechanisms that no longer serve us, right? Like, at what point does Isaac have to stop running? Because running is no longer, that giving him that outlet of safe adventure, finding himself. It's no longer finding himself, but running from himself.
Yeah.
And him finding that journey of okay, I can rest now because I've completed what I wanted to do. But I thought that was a really beautiful quote that sums up a lot of trauma
Yeah.
responses.
This is definitely a book I'm keeping, and we'll probably be reading several more times because I think there's more in there than I caught this time through.
Yeah, this is a book you can definitely read a few times and pull something different from it each time,
Yeah.
which anytime I have a book that's like that I read, you gotta hold on to it.
Yeah, definitely. So, do we want to talk about next month?
Yes.
So, you chose The Heaven and Earth Grocery Store by James McBride.
Mhm.
So, this should be fun. I don't think I've read any of James McBride.
I don't think so, me either. And I honestly barely know what it's about, but I read like the first sentence of the synopsis. It seemed very interesting.
Oh.
It's new, I believe. No?
Yes, I believe
Um,
so.
yeah.
At least a frontless book, a 2023 book.
Yes. The Heaven and Earth Grocery Store is going to be a fiction story about a 1970s small town where there's a developing project going on, like a construction project, and because of that, secrets start coming out and skeletons start coming out of people's closets, and it gets pretty interesting, and that's all I'm gonna say. But I do very much enjoy like a small town secrets coming out of the woodwork kind of trope in books. So I'm very excited to see how that plays out, and we're going to be reading that for the month of September. So check back in at the end of the month for our thoughts, and we'll give our thumbs up or a thumbs down. But either way, we're going to give our thoughts and tell you how we enjoyed the reading, and you can come and follow us along for our collected stories.